the, what I would call Afrikaner elite in South Africa, what many people were waiting for was the politicians to say, yes, it was wrong, it went horribly wrong, and really we all need to take responsibility. And when that didn't happen, what you had was really the outing of the trigger pullers, and what that allowed white South Africa to do, or the beneficiaries of apartheid, and many black South Africans who were complicit with the former state as well, to sit back and to say, they did it, we didn't know. And I think where the Commission really failed was to really address this question of the beneficiary and who benefited from apartheid. The apartheid government was voted in successively with huge majorities. It wasn't just Afrikaners, there were white South Africans who voted them, English South Africans who also voted them into power. But it was so easy for the merchant class or business to say, well, they're the ones who ran the state. And at the end of the Truth Commission, one of my colleagues and I, and of course the Minister of Justice, we sat down twice with business to say, well, we believe you need to also participate in the reparation process. And of course, business said, well, this is the state's responsibility. And the government at the time let them off the hook. Years later, many of my white colleagues on the Commission started what they call the Home for All Fund. And they were vilified and pilloried, with many people writing to them to say, who the hell do you think you are? What they were saying is, we need to acknowledge our collective responsibility. We need to find ways of participating in reparation programs which will in fact acknowledge the benefit that we have in fact received. And of course, tragically, that hasn't happened. And quite frankly, I think South Africa is at a crisis point. If we do not recognize that 80% of our population lives in want, in hunger, destitute, I'm not sure how many more high electric fences we can build. One of my colleagues is a lawyer who started pro bono, and she was telling me that it was very difficult to bring the Sandton lawyers to Braamfontein. Many of them never crossed that way, and it is even more difficult for people to go to Soweto. And I said to her, well, actually, it is not just our white colleagues. Many of our black comrades have forgotten what it is like to live in an informal settlement, and in fact in a township. And many people don't go home from Sandton or from the very nice posh suburbs they live in. And if we want to be real about changing South Africa, then that is the challenge, to put ourselves in the feet of the people, the shoes of the people who actually live every day. I don't know why we have not yet had our own Arab Spring. Quite frankly, I think South Africans are a very patient group. In terms of your question around the US and the UK, I agree with you. And I mean, one of the most difficult things this year or last year was when the Secretary General appointed 3 of us to investigate what happened in Sri Lanka. Sri Lankan war, the final phase of it started in September 2009 and ended in May 2010. In the course of the last 3 months, from January to May, more than 75,000 people were killed. And the UN and international community willingly agreed with the Sri Lankan government's request to leave the conflict area. And if you look at the pictures of ordinary civilians who were treated as combatants, who were shot in the back, who were starved to death, one of the questions I ask is, how could it happen? And I think as we are watching what is happening in Syria today, we can also ask the question, why is the world allowing that to happen? Why is the world allowing that to happen? And quite frankly, we have to look at the United States and their war on terror policy. The Sri Lankan government, when we tried to push a resolution in the Human Rights Council this year, said, we have been fighting an asymmetrical conflict. And in an asymmetrical conflict, the Geneva Conventions don't apply. Now, this is, of course, exactly the argument that is being advanced by the United States government under George Bush and of course now under President Barack Obama. When Obama was still campaigning for presidency, at that point there were really discussions around setting up a Truth Commission in America. Today, many of my colleagues who work at the Center for Constitutional Law argue that when they go to these trials, exactly the same arguments are being used by the Obama government. And I think many of us know that many of the lawyers who were appointed have argued about the fact that they are not even allowed to interview their clients in private. So I think that if you look at the mockery of the Security Council, if you look at the Human Rights Council, I mean, at the end of the day, it's about politics. And really, civil society needs to hold their governments accountable. You asked the question about Kulamani. Between 2003, when we handed in the report, and 2007, there were two of us, a colleague and myself, who alone worked with Kulamani on these issues. We could not get support from the human rights community. It was only around 2009 that we began to build a coalition, and today you have a vibrant coalition of at least 6 human rights organizations who are willing to take these cases to court. But at the same time, if we want to succeed, we need to build a broader base of South Africans who see these issues as part of a social justice agenda. In terms of the non-prosecution, there's a very famous example in Cape Town of the Trojan horse case, where the state refused to prosecute, and then the community brought their own private prosecution and were fairly successful. What we are asking, every time on the Simelane case, whenever we have been assigned a policeman, it has usually been a sweeper, and that is why we've in fact had to go outside and in fact appoint our own investigator. The next step, of course, is to get the NPA to agree that they will issue a formal note that they will not prosecute, and that will hopefully allow us then to bring our own private prosecution. Big stumbling blocks within, I think, 15 days of you mounting the case, you have to file security. And because this case will be against a number of the generals who are very well organized, we suspect that there will be a hefty amount of security that they will ask for to be filed. So these are some, what you have really is it makes it very, very difficult for ordinary citizens to bring their cases to the courts. And of course we see that with normal legal cases as well.
Let's give somebody else a chance. I'll come back to you shortly. There's no one else asking a question. Sure.
Thank you for your presentation. I think your argument in critique the Truth and Reconciliation Commission it was very clear. But what I want to know is the civil society going to win this war, or just mere? It's a situation of pointing out what should have been done and what should be done in the future, and is the future bright for us?
You will take a second question? Would you like to answer?
Oh, yes. You mentioned in your response to the questions and comments that in South Africa, when certain Afrikaners or the special branch, etc., always referred to somebody else, it was the other. And I just wanted to point out, for example, in France now today, you are seeing around Paris more and more signs that acknowledge that Jewish children were taken away to the extermination camps. And it was with the collaboration, the plaque stated with the collaboration of the Vichy government, never the French government. And it is the same with Nazi Germany. When we talk about the Holocaust and who was responsible, it was Nazi Germany, never the German government. And so this is history repeating itself.
Indeed, it is. Yesterday we found no one who voted for the Nationalist Party ever. Their football party. Just the next day after 1994.
Yes.
After the election.
Now, this is an
Point taken.
international mindset. People to avoid responsibility.
It's really kind of interesting because earlier this year, one of somebody I know at is an emeritus professor at one of the Belgian universities, and he and 9 other professors have done a study on 10 countries in Europe and how they in fact address their past. And needless to say, of course, Spain leads Spain is at the head of the pack, with Portugal following, but the attempts to deal with the accountability question in many of these countries is, of course, something that leaves a lot to be desired. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about, in France, there was always this mythology that everybody was part of the resistance movement. And it was really only when Maurice Papin and the Klaus Barbie trial took place that you finally got a sense of how complicit many French people, including different elements of both the Vichy government and the de Gaulle government, in fact, had been complicit in what had happened during the Holocaust. And I think that goes for many, many other countries of the world. And I think what that raises is a very important question, the history or the historical narrative. And it's also about dealing with the mythology. And if you don't address the mythology, then of course you have a revisionism, and in fact what you begin to build your society on is based on this mythology. And for me, that is why I talked about, when you look at this question of the right to know, the right to the truth, on the one level it's about you, the individual victim. You want to know what has happened. But at another level, it is really about the right of citizens to demand an accounting. The fact that you can argue and say, this is your obligation, to go and unpack that. Now this, of course, is a very difficult question for many societies, because the narrative of the victim is a very important one for many countries to cling onto. And if you look at South Africa, for instance, the narrative of we were the combatants, we were the ones in exile, what does it create? A passport to entitlement. It is something that other people will never be let off the hook for, because what it is our ticket. And I think this is something we have to address. In terms of civil society, you're part of that civil society. And if we want